cold of the Charles Bridge was a living thing. It was not the crisp, clean cold of a clear winter night, but a sentient malevolence that rose from the ancient, moss-slicked stones of the Karlov most. A primordial chill that had nothing to do with mere weather. It seeped through the thin, hand-stitched leather soles of his shoes. A familiar and unwelcome guest in the Prague winter of 1983. Jack Thorne felt it climb his ankles, a serpent of wet, mineral ice working its insidious way up his bones, past his knees, settling deep in his marrow. It was a cold that had no counterpart in nature. It was the specific, internal freeze of a chessboard, when you suddenly, sickeningly, realize you are no longer the player, but merely a pawn, positioned for a sacrifice you cannot comprehend in a game whose rules were written in a language you were never taught. He pulled the collar of his heavy wool coat tighter, the rough, dark gray fabric scratching at his neck like a nervous hand. The air was thick, a miasma of smells that defined the city's winter breath. The damp, organic scent of the Vltava River churning black and sullen below. A smell of mud and forgotten history. The sharp, mineral tang of centuries-old stone and mortar. And the pervasive, low-grade, acrid perfume of burning lignite coal that hung over the entire basin like a shroud, catching in the back of his throat with every breath. He checked his watch, a cheap Soviet-made Rakita, a deliberate and carefully chosen piece of his cover. Its luminous dial, a sickly green in the gloom, was painted with radium that was likely slowly poisoning him. A low-level betrayal he carried on his own wrist. The second hand swept with a jerky, nervous rhythm that perfectly matched the frantic, syncopated beating in his own chest. 23:55. 5 minutes to midnight. The bridge was empty, a stone artery cleared for the city's heart to stop. It was profoundly, unnervingly wrong. Even on the coldest nights, the Karlov most was never truly deserted. There were always late-night tourists, their breath pluming in the frigid air as they fumbled with cameras, or bundled-up lovers stealing a moment of privacy in the stone alcoves between the statues of saints. Tonight, they had all vanished, as if a silent alarm had been sounded, a high-frequency squeal on a frequency only the city's true, wary inhabitants could hear, a signal to scurry back into the warrens of the old town. He was alone, a solitary figure lit by the jaundiced, flickering glow of the gas lamps. Their weak light cast long, distorted shadows that writhed and danced on the cobblestones like tormented spirits, making the Baroque statues seem to shift and lean in their niches. He was a perfect target, a single pin on an empty bowling alley. Every instinct, honed by a brutal decade of living in the shadows, from the sun-blasted alleyways of Beirut to the divided, paranoid streets of Berlin, screamed at him. This was a setup. The pattern was wrong. The silence was too loud, too absolute. Earlier, on his surveillance detection run, a grueling 3-hour, meticulously planned, seemingly random walk through the labyrinthine streets of Mala Strana, he'd felt the faintest tremor in the web. It wasn't one single, identifiable mistake by the opposition, but an accumulation of tiny, dissonant notes that, when played together, formed a chord of pure dread. He had started his SDR as always, exiting the side gate of the embassy compound and walking at a brisk, purposeful pace, a man on his way to a late dinner. He'd turned onto Nerudova Street, the steep, winding lane that led up to the castle. Halfway up, he feigned a stumble, dropping his leather gloves. As he bent to retrieve them, a move that gave him a legitimate reason to stop and scan his surroundings for a full 10 seconds, he saw it. A flicker of movement in a third-story window. It wasn't a curtain stirred by the wind. It was the distinct, metallic glint of binoculars, a pair of Zeiss Jana 8 times 30 seconds, retracting too quickly. They were good binoculars, but the man holding them was an amateur, moving too fast, drawing the eye. An hour later, as he doubled back through a narrow, unlit passage off Tomaszka, a shortcut no tourist would ever find, he caught a scent on the still, cold air. The acrid, throat-burning smell of cheap papyrus cigarettes, a harsh, unfiltered brand favored by the STB's low-level street watchers. He had passed this same darkened doorway 40 minutes before, and it had been empty. Now it held a watcher who was not only clumsy enough to smoke on the job, but was smoking a brand that was practically a uniform. The watchers were leaving a scent trail a bloodhound could follow. Then there was the car. A gray Skoda 120, a vehicle as ubiquitous and dreary as the regime itself. Its engine making a wheezing, asthmatic sound. It had taken the same illogical turn onto a one-way street he did. A move that should have drawn the immediate attention of the Vizhena Bezpečnost police who patrolled the area. But it hadn't. It peeled off a block later with an uncharacteristically loud squeal of its worn Barum tires. The maneuver was too clumsy, too theatrical for the STB's elite surveillance teams, the professionals who could tail a ghost through a blizzard without leaving a footprint. This was a third-string team, a B team, and B teams weren't used for subtle observation. They were used to herd. They weren't trying to see where he was going. They already knew. They were just making sure he got there, like beaters driving a pheasant toward the waiting guns. He leaned against the cold stone balustrade, the dampness seeping instantly into the fabric of his coat. His gaze was fixed on the far end of the bridge, toward the brooding Gothic spires of the old town square. She would be coming from that direction. Katerina, his asset, his obsession, his love. Over the past 6 months, the two had become so dangerously, inextricably intertwined that he could no longer see the seam where his professional duties ended and his personal desperation began. Her final message had been delivered 2 days ago, via the prearranged dead drop in the overgrown, melancholic Olshani cemetery. It was tucked into a hollowed-out book of poetry by Jizzy Wolker, left by the grave of a forgotten socialist poet. The message was simple, a coded phrase transmitted by burst encryption from the embassy's bubble room at 415.5 megahertz and passed to him on a one-time pad. The swallows fly south for the winter. It translated to a single, explosive concept. Tonight. The final piece. Bring the question I have been waiting for. The question? It sat in the inner pocket of his coat, a small, heavy velvet box. Inside rested a modest ring, a deep blue sapphire flanked by 2 tiny, glittering diamonds. He had purchased it from a nervous, sweating jeweler in a back-alley shop in Vienna. A man whose hands trembled so badly, Jack wondered if he was a fellow traveler in the world of shadows. He'd smuggled it across the heavily guarded Austrian border inside a tube of signal toothpaste. A ridiculous, almost comical detail in an operation that was anything but. It was a prop, a piece of operational hardware. Langley had insisted in a series of increasingly frantic cables, a necessary tool to complete the exfiltration of the most valuable Warsaw Pact asset in a generation. But for Jack, the line between prop and reality had blurred into non-existence. When he pictured slipping it onto her finger, the feeling wasn't one of operational success, but of a desperate, terrifying, and utterly unprofessional hope. He scanned the bridge again. The Baroque statues of saints in their stone niches, John of Nepomuk, his finger to his lips in a gesture of eternal silence. Saints Cyril and Methodius, their faces grim and unyielding. A sorrowful Pietà, Mary cradling her dead son, seemed to watch him with ancient, weary pity. They had seen it all before. Invasions, plagues, revolutions, and the quiet, personal tragedies of countless souls. He had run the scenarios 1,000 times in his head. The proposal on the bridge was her idea. It was romantic, poetic, and operationally insane. An open-air meeting in the most iconic exposed spot in Prague? It violated every rule in the book, every lesson learned in the farm's classrooms and the world's back alleys. But she had insisted, her voice urgent during their last hurried meeting in the shadow of St. Vitus Cathedral. The gargoyles looking down like silent stone chaperones. "It's the only way, Jack," she had whispered, her breath misting in the cold air. A public declaration, a moment of such pure Western sentimentality that the watchers, if there are any, will be disarmed by its audacity. It will be our cover. I will weep. I will say yes. We will embrace. A diplomat and his new Czech fiancée. Who would dare interfere with something so bourgeois? From there, the plan was to wrap themselves in diplomatic immunity. The paperwork, the pressure from the embassy, the flight to freedom. It was a fairy tale. And in the cold, hard world of espionage, fairy tales were just well-designed traps. He saw her then, a silhouette detaching itself from the deeper shadows of the old town bridge tower. She was wrapped in a dark coat, a splash of red from her scarf, the only color in the monochrome night, a defiant slash against the gray. Even at this distance, her walk was unmistakable. A graceful, determined stride that had first caught his eye in a crowded, smoke-filled reception at the French embassy 6 months ago. He felt a surge of something warm in his chest, a traitorous heat that fought against the encroaching ice. He told himself it was adrenaline, the final surge before the mission's climax. He was lying, and he knew it. As she drew closer, the jaundiced lamplight caught her face, pale and luminous. Her expression was unreadable. It was not the joyful anticipation of a lover, not the nervous tension of an operative at a critical meet. It was something else. A profound, hollowed-out stillness. It was the face of someone walking to their own execution. His hand tightened on the velvet box in his pocket, the plush fabric suddenly feeling abrasive and alien. The plan, the one he and Langley had reluctantly agreed to, was to let her get within 10 feet. He would step forward, meet her in the exact center of the bridge, a spot marked by the small, worn brass cross of St. John of Nepomuk embedded in the stones. The words were already rehearsed, a script written not by him, but by Langley's top behavioral analysts, designed to sound spontaneous and heartfelt. But as she closed the distance, the details he'd noticed earlier, the wrongness of the quiet, the herding surveillance, her funereal expression, slammed into his consciousness with the force of a physical blow. He saw it all with sickening, crystalline clarity. At the Mala Strana end of the bridge, a black Tatra 613, the sleek V8-powered chariot of the STB elite, had pulled up, its engine a low, predatory growl that was swallowed by the night. It was parked at an angle, blocking his escape route back to the embassy quarter. At the old town end, where Katarina had just emerged, another Tatra slid silently into place, its headlights off. The trap was set. The jaws were closing. She was 10 feet away now. She stopped. Her eyes, those beautiful, dark, intelligent eyes that had held such promises of a future filled with books and art and freedom, met his. They were filled with an apology so deep, so absolute, it was an abyss. "Jack," she said, her voice a fragile whisper that the wind almost stole and carried away down the river. He didn't move. He couldn't. His training was screaming at him, Compromised. Egress now. Protocol 7. To run, to jump, to do anything. There was a protocol for this. The L-pill, the cyanide capsule sewn into the hem of his collar, was a last resort for just such a moment of catastrophic failure. But his body was frozen, caught between the primal instinct for survival and the powerful gravitational anchor of her gaze. "They're here," he stated, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. It wasn't a question. She gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. A single tear, perfect and glistening, traced a path down her cold cheek. "I am so sorry." From the shadows near the bridge tower, a figure emerged. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a fine wool overcoat, his silver hair catching the lamplight. Jack knew him instantly, though he'd only ever seen him in grainy surveillance photos and top-secret intelligence reports. Colonel Viktor Orlov, the KGB's resident in Prague, the chess master. He walked with an unhurried, proprietary air, as if he owned the very stones of the bridge, as if the city itself were his personal board. He stopped beside Katerina, placing a paternal, yet possessive, hand on her shoulder. "There is no need for apologies, Anya," Orlov said, his Russian-accented Czech as smooth and cold as aged vodka. "You have served the motherland with distinction." He turned his cold gray eyes, the color of a winter sky, to Jack. "Anya Petrova, Captain, Committee for State Security, one of our finest officers. I believe you know her as Katerina." The name Anya landed like a punch to the gut, knocking the air from Jack's lungs. Everything contracted, the world shrinking to the space between him, the woman he thought he loved, and the man who held her leash. The velvet box in his pocket suddenly felt like a tumor, a malignant growth of his own foolishness. The question he was supposed to ask died on his lips, replaced by the bitter, metallic taste of ash. This trap hadn't been set tonight. It had been under construction for 6 months, built brick by brick with shared secrets, stolen kisses, and whispered promises of a future that was never meant to be. It was built under the watchful, patient eyes of the KGB. And he, Jack Thorne, the CIA's rising star in Eastern Europe, praised for his meticulous tradecraft and his ability to cultivate assets, had been its chief architect and its only intended victim. The story of his downfall, he knew with a chilling, absolute certainty, had begun long before this bridge. It began with the promise of the ultimate prize, the red cipher. Langley had been obsessed with it for years, a whisper that grew into a roar in the halls of headquarters. It was the holy grail of signals intelligence, the new, unbreakable one-time pad system the Warsaw Pact was set to roll out across its entire command and control network. Breaking it wouldn't just be an advantage. It would be like listening in on God's private telephone line to the Kremlin. The station chief in Vienna, a grizzled cold warrior named Frank Gibbons, had called it the key to the whole damn kingdom, in a cable encrypted with a system Jack now realized was probably obsolete. His posting as a cultural attaché at the American Embassy in Prague was deep cover, a perfect perch from which to hunt for sources inside the Czechoslovakian government. He was a patient man, a cultivator. He didn't chase wild rumors. He built relationships. He spent months mapping the social and professional networks of ministry officials, academics, and artists, looking for the telltale signs of vulnerability: debt, disillusionment, blackmail, or ego. He first met Captain Anya Petrova at that dreary reception celebrating a new exhibition of socialist realist art. She was introduced as Katerina Novak, an assistant curator at the Ministry of Culture, a seemingly minor functionary with sad eyes and a brilliant mind. But she was different. While others spouted party-line platitudes about artistic duty to the state, she possessed a quiet, subversive intelligence. She would guide him to a painting of a heroic tractor driver and whisper, "Notice the sky. The artist has made it the color of a bruise. A very brave choice, don't you think?" Her eyes held a spark of defiance, a weariness with the gray conformity of the regime. Or so he had thought. So he had been meant to think. Their first few conversations were cautious, intellectual dances around forbidden topics. She spoke of Kafka, of the Prague Spring, of the forgotten poets who wrote of freedom. It was a classic recruitment profile, almost too perfect. She was the disillusioned intellectual, starved for the free air of the West. He began the slow, delicate process of reeling her in. He would lend her a banned book, a Milan Kundera novel smuggled in the diplomatic pouch. She would return it a week later with a note tucked inside, a single line of poetry that hinted at her yearning. The first piece of intelligence she offered was small, almost trivial. A list of artists deemed politically unreliable by the ministry. It was a test for both of them. He had to verify it, to prove she was genuine. Langley confirmed 2 of the names on the list were quietly arrested the following week. She was credible. The hook was set. He formalized the relationship, running her as a classic clandestine asset. They established a communication plan based on layers of security. Signal sites were chosen across the city. A potted geranium on a specific windowsill on Kampa Island meant she had something for him. A chalk mark on a particular lamppost in Yosefov meant he needed to service a dead drop. The dead drops themselves were works of art. A magnetized container hidden in the cistern of a rarely used public toilet in the Clementinum Library, where the smell of mildew and old paper provided its own kind of cover. A microdot concealed beneath a postage stamp on a postcard mailed to a cutout address in Austria. The tradecraft was meticulous, exhausting. Every meeting, every drop, was preceded by a grueling surveillance detection run. Jack would leave the embassy and enter the city's circulatory system, his senses on high alert. He would walk for hours, his path a deliberate rejection of logic. He'd board a tram only to get off one stop later. He'd enter the Kotva department store through one door and exit through another, pausing in the menswear section to use the reflection in a glass counter to watch his own back trail. He searched for the telltale dance of surveillance. 2 men, casually dressed, who somehow always seemed to be in his periphery. The box, as it was called, a team of 4 to 6 watchers, notoriously difficult to spot. But he was good. He was one of the best. He never once detected a tail. That should have been his first and loudest warning. The best surveillance isn't the kind you spot. It's the kind you never even know is there. As the weeks turned into months, the intelligence she provided grew in significance. Ministry reports, internal memos, transcripts of conversations between Czech and Soviet officials. She had, she explained, a lover high up in the STB. A married man who was powerful but careless after drinking. It was a plausible story, a classic honey trap in reverse. Plausible enough for Langley to swallow, especially given the quality of the product. The file on asset Katerina grew thick with commendations, but as the professional relationship solidified, a personal one began to blossom in the cracks. Their brush passes in crowded markets became moments of charged intimacy, their fingers lingering for a fraction of a second too long. Their brief meetings in the secluded corners of the Vertbach garden, under the guise of discussing art, were filled with attention that had nothing to do with espionage. He knew the risks. He knew the first rule of handling an asset: never get emotionally involved. It was a commandment etched in the stone of every agency training manual. Emotion clouded judgment. It created vulnerabilities. It got people killed. He knew all of this, and he ignored it. He was lonely. The life of a deep cover officer was a life of profound, crushing isolation. He was a ghost, haunting a city that was not his own, surrounded by people to whom he could never tell the truth. Anya, Katerina, was the first person in years who seemed to see the man behind the mask. She didn't just see the American diplomat. She saw Jack. Their first kiss was in a downpour, huddled in the doorway of a forgotten church near the castle. It was a reckless, stupid act that broke a dozen protocols. And it was the most real thing he had felt in a decade. From that moment on, the operation began to unravel, even as it seemed to be reaching its zenith. Their meetings became less about passing intelligence and more about stolen moments of connection. They were no longer just handler and asset. They were lovers, plotting a future that seemed impossibly distant. He started taking shortcuts. He truncated his SDRs, telling himself he was being efficient, not complacent. He agreed to meetings in locations of her choosing, ceding control. Every decision was a small compromise, a tiny betrayal of his training, justified by the intoxicating belief that their connection was real, that it was their shield. Then came the bombshell. In a hushed, breathless meeting in their usual spot, a quiet alcove overlooking the city, she told him she had access to the red cipher. Her STB lover was part of the technical team implementing the system. He kept a copy of the core key generation algorithms and the initial one-time pads in his office safe. She could get them, all of them. The news hit Langley like a lightning strike. The red cipher was the stuff of legend. If Katerina could deliver it, she would go down in the agency's history. The risks were astronomical, but the potential reward was immeasurable. Gibbon's cable from Vienna was simple. Do whatever it takes. This is priority one. The first package arrived a week later, delivered through a new, high-risk dead drop she had insisted on. A hollowed-out brick in a wall near the Lenin Wall, a place crawling with tourists and, inevitably, secret police. Jack felt a prickle of deep unease, but the data was pure gold. The preliminary analysis from the codebreakers at Fort Meade confirmed it. This was the genuine article. It was only a fragment, but it was enough to prove her access. The pressure from Langley intensified. They wanted the rest, and they wanted the asset out. An exfiltration plan was drawn up, a complex operation involving a fake passport, a sympathetic contact in the Austrian embassy, and a tense border crossing in the back of a diplomatic supply truck. But when Jack presented the plan to her, she refused. She shook her head, her eyes wide with what he mistook for fear. "It's too dangerous, Jack. They watch the borders too closely. My lover, he is powerful. If he suspects we are both dead, then what do you suggest?" he had asked, his frustration mounting. "We can't leave you here." That was when she played her masterstroke, the move that Orlov had no doubt spent months preparing. She took his hands, her touch sending a familiar jolt through him. "There is another way," she whispered, "a way they would never expect. Marry me, Jack." He stared at her, stunned. "Think about it," she urged, her voice a torrent of desperate logic. "You are a diplomat. They would not dare to stop the fiancé of an American diplomat from leaving the country. It would cause an international incident. We would walk out through the front door in plain sight. It is the only way." It was brilliant. It was insane. It was the most romantic and terrifying thing he had ever heard. His training officer's voice screamed in his head, "It's a trap! She's playing you!" But the man who was in love with her, the man who desperately wanted to believe in their fairy tale, silenced that voice. He took the proposal to Langley. The response was a firestorm of disbelief and suspicion. The cable from the director himself was blunt. "Absolutely not. Agent is compromised. Extract immediately or terminate contact." But Jack fought back. He wrote long, passionate analyses, arguing that Katerina's plan was an act of audacious genius, a classic example of hiding in plain sight. He staked his reputation, his career, on her loyalty. He painted a picture of a terrified woman in love, using the only weapon she had to secure her freedom. He was so convincing because he had already convinced himself. The codebreakers at Fort Meade were his unwitting allies. The small piece of the red cipher they had was so tantalizing, the prospect of getting the rest so overwhelming, that it began to warp the agency's judgment. Slowly, reluctantly, they began to see his point. The risk was unprecedented, but the prize was the whole game. Finally, after weeks of heated debate, Langley capitulated. They approved the plan, with 100 caveats and protocols. The marriage proposal was to be the final exfiltration signal. He would propose on the Charles Bridge at midnight. Her acceptance would be the signal that she had secured the final data package containing the complete cipher. The next morning, he would officially announce their engagement at the embassy, and the diplomatic machine would grind into motion. And so he had found himself on the bridge, the velvet box a dead weight in his pocket, walking into the most elegant and devastating trap in the KGB's recent history. Now, standing in the center of that same bridge, flanked by the ghosts of saints, with Orlov's smug pronouncement echoing in the frigid air, the full scale of the deception crashed down on him. Every shared secret had been a lie. Every tender touch had been a carefully calibrated act. Every piece of intelligence she had passed, from the list of artists to the fragment of the red cipher, had been meticulously curated disinformation, designed to build his trust, to inflate her value, to lure him deeper into the web. She wasn't an asset he was handling. She was a handler, and he was her mark. "The red cipher," Jack said, his voice a hollow rasp. It was all fake. Orlov chuckled, a dry, grating sound like stones grinding together. "Oh, not at all, Mr. Thorne. The fragment we allowed you to have was perfectly genuine. We needed you and your brilliant analysts at Fort Meade to believe in the prize. We needed you to be hungry for it. So hungry you would abandon your training, your caution, your common sense." Two men in long coats emerged from the shadows behind Orlov. They were large, impassive, their faces looking as if they were carved from granite. They moved to stand on either side of Jack. He didn't resist. There was nowhere to run. "Why?" Jack asked, his eyes locked on Anya. He didn't call her Katerina. That woman had never existed. "Why go to all this trouble? Just to capture one case officer?" Orlov smiled, a thin, cruel slash in his pale face. "You flatter yourself, Mr. Thorne. Capturing you is a pleasant bonus, a trophy. But you were never the primary target. You were merely the delivery system." He gestured vaguely toward the west. "You see, we have a problem. We had a genuine leak in the red cipher program, a traitor in Warsaw. A small but significant part of the system was compromised and passed to one of your sister agencies. A regrettable security breach. We could, of course, scrap the entire system and start over. A costly and time-consuming endeavor. Or we could convince your side that the authentic data they hold is, in fact, worthless disinformation." The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place, and the sheer, diabolical brilliance of the plan left Jack breathless. "Me," he whispered. This whole operation, it's to discredit the real leak. Precisely, Orlov confirmed, his voice filled with intellectual satisfaction. In a few hours, the Czechoslovakian government will issue a formal protest. They will announce the capture of a CIA spy. Caught red-handed, they will present evidence, tapes of your meetings, and most importantly, the intelligence you received from our officer Petrova here. All of it will be shown to be cleverly fabricated lies, including the sample of the red cipher. We will prove, with your own captured testimony, that this entire affair was a KGB sting operation. Your agency, faced with such overwhelming proof, will have no choice but to conclude that their other source, the real leak in Warsaw, was also part of our grand deception. They will discard the authentic intelligence they hold, believing it to be poisoned fruit from the same tree. You, my dear Mr. Thorne, are the grand finale of our magic trick. You are the misdirection that makes the real secret safe. It was a masterpiece of counterintelligence, an operation of breathtaking complexity and cruelty. He hadn't just been captured. He had been weaponized against his own side. His failure would echo for years, poisoning the CIA's trust in its own intelligence. He looked at Anya one last time. Her face was a mask of conflicted sorrow. Was any of it real? He would never know. That uncertainty was a special kind of torture, one Orlov had no doubt designed for him. And her? Jack asked, nodding toward Anya. What's her reward for this? A medal? Orlov's expression hardened. Officer Petrova will be debriefed. She allowed the emotional component of the operation to become untidy. She showed weakness. He glanced at the tear track on her cheek with cold disdain. That will be noted in her file. The two silent men grabbed Jack's arms. They expertly twisted them behind his back. The burn of an impending dislocation, a sharp, grounding pain. One of them ran a practiced hand over his body, finding and removing his wallet, keys, the Raketa watch, and the Walther PPK holstered at the small of his back. And of course, the velvet box. The man opened it and showed it to Orlov. The sapphire winked. Orlov took the box and walked over to Anya. He held it out to her. A souvenir of your performance, he said, his voice laced with contempt. She stared at the ring as if it were a venomous snake. She didn't take it. Orlov shrugged and snapped the box shut, slipping it into his own pocket. A pity. They began to march Jack toward the waiting Tatra. As they passed Anya, he turned his head, needing to ask one final question. Was it all a lie, Anya? Everything? She looked at him, and for a fleeting second, the mask cracked. He saw a flicker of the woman who loved Kafka. Her lips parted, but before she could speak, Orlov stepped between them. Do not speak to the prisoner, Orlov commanded her. Then to Jack, he added, You must understand, Mr. Thorne. In our world, the only truth is the one that serves the mission. You tried to buy a woman's soul with a fantasy. We simply reminded her where her duty lay. It seems duty is the stronger currency. They bundled him into the back of the Tatra. The door slammed shut with a heavy, final thud. The engine roared, and the car lurched forward, whisking him away from the bridge, away from the life he had known. Through the tinted rear window, he saw the Charles Bridge receding into the mist. He could just make out two figures still standing there. The tall silhouette of the chess master and the smaller, solitary form of the woman who had checkmated him. Then they too were swallowed by the Prague night. The journey was short, not to a Czech prison, but to a quiet military airfield. There, a hulking Ilyushin IL-76 transport plane waited, its engines whining. There was no paperwork. He was cargo, transferred from one container to another. Inside the vast, echoing hold, he was shackled to a bench. The ramp closed, plunging him into absolute darkness and the deafening roar. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew he would never see the West again. Moscow, the Lubyanka. The interrogations began the moment he landed. They were not brutal, not at first. They were methodical and psychologically devastating. He was placed in a small, windowless cell, the walls a sickly yellow, the single bare bulb in the ceiling humming 24 hours a day. Sleep deprivation was the first tool. Then came the questions, hour after hour, from a rotating team. They already knew everything. They weren't seeking information. They were dismantling his reality, forcing him to assemble the narrative of his own failure brick by brick until it became a confession that would be the centerpiece of their propaganda victory. They showed him videos of his meetings with Anya, filmed with a cold, clinical precision. They played him audio recordings of their whispered conversations, his declarations of love now sounding pathetic and naive. They made him watch himself being played over and over until he could no longer trust his own memory. His primary interrogator, a patient, avuncular man named Major Grishin, simply smiled and poured tea from a battered samovar. "We have time, Jack," Grishin would say, his voice a soothing balm of poison. "But what are you protecting? Your agency? They have already written you off. They believe you were a fool seduced by a pretty face. They are, as we speak, purging every piece of intelligence you ever submitted. You are not a hero to them. You are an embarrassment, a case study of what not to do." He knew Grishin was right. That was the most corrosive part. He wasn't a martyr. He was a cautionary tale. The breaking point came a month into his captivity. Grishin entered the cell with a small Sony television on a trolley. "A gift from Colonel Orlov," Grishin announced. "He thought you would appreciate seeing the fruits of your labor." He switched on the television. It was the Soviet news program, Vremya. The anchor spoke in solemn Russian about a great victory for state security. And then they showed the press conference. A Czech general stood at a podium. Behind him, a large board with photographs. Jack, Anya, and a close-up of a schematic labeled Red Cipher. The general explained how the brave security services of the Warsaw Pact had successfully turned a CIA spy. Then Anya was brought to the stage. She looked different. Her hair was pulled back in a severe bun. She wore a plain, dark suit. The defiant, artistic woman was gone, replaced by a cold, composed officer. She stepped to the microphone and, in a clear, emotionless voice, read a prepared statement detailing how she had targeted him, identified his psychological vulnerabilities, his professional pride, his loneliness, and exploited them for the glory of the state. She was utterly convincing. But Jack saw the faint tremor in her hand as she held the paper, the way she never once looked directly at the camera. He saw the hollowed-out look in her eyes, a look he recognized from the bridge. It was the look of a prisoner. Then came the final blow. The broadcast cut to a Kremlin awards ceremony inside the Grand St. George's Hall. The camera zoomed in as a Soviet general pinned the Order of the Red Banner to Colonel Viktor Orlov's chest. And standing just behind him, among the other honored officers, was Anya Petrova. She wore the uniform of a KGB captain, and on her chest was a medal of her own. She stared straight ahead, her face a perfect, unreadable mask. Grishin switched off the television. The silence in the cell was absolute, broken only by the hum of the light. "You see, Jack?" Grishin said softly. "The game is over. You have lost." In that moment, something inside Jack Thorne finally broke. It was the sight of her in that uniform, the living embodiment of his utter and complete failure. He had not only been betrayed, he had been erased. He picked up the pen. He began to write. Years later, long after the wall had fallen and the Soviet Union had crumbled into history, a file was quietly declassified in the CIA archives. It was the post-mortem report on the Prague betrayal, codenamed Operation Swallow Song. A final handwritten addendum was attached, written by Frank Gibbons, the retired Vienna station chief, from his home overlooking the Blue Ridge Mountains. The addendum noted a strange anomaly. For nearly 2 years after Thorne's capture, Allied signals intelligence had registered a statistically significant drop in the effectiveness of Warsaw Pact military communications. Messages were being garbled, orders delayed, large-scale exercises fumbled with an inexplicable lack of coordination. It was as if their unbreakable red cipher was, for some reason, not working. The anomaly was never explained. It was dismissed as a coincidence, a ghost in the machine, and eventually forgotten as the Cold War thawed. But 1,000 miles away, in a small, cramped apartment in Moscow, a woman in her late 50s would sometimes, late at night, take out a small velvet box. She would open it and stare at the modest sapphire ring inside. She had stolen it from Orlov's desk the day before he was recalled to Moscow. A foolish, sentimental act that could have cost her everything. She never wore it. She just looked at it and remembered a cold night on a bridge and a question that was never asked. Her name was Anya Petrova, a decorated captain of the KGB. And the greatest secret she ever kept was not the one she had been ordered to protect, but the one she had managed to give away. The fragment of the red cipher she had passed to Jack, the piece Orlov had so smugly confirmed was genuine, had contained a flaw, a tiny, elegant, and catastrophic error she had subtly introduced into the algorithm data. A single transposed variable in the key generation algorithm's pseudo-random number seed. It was a flaw that would have been undetectable in a small sample. But when extrapolated across the entire system, it would create cascading,